This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Talks are set to begin in Washington, D.C. as the U.S. mediates a standoff over Ethiopia's mega dam. Sudan's Prime Minister visits Darfur conflict victims and promises quick resettlement. And Parliament is dissolved in the UK after rejecting Boris Johnson's latest Brexit deal. Hello and a very warm welcome to Africa Live on CGTN. I'm Lindy Mtongana in Nairobi. And with me is Penina Karibe with a preview of your business news.
Thank you, Lindy. Coming up on Africa Live Business. Zimbabwe fires doctors as workers' strike extends past 60 days. And we look at developments at the 23rd session of the Intergovernmental Committee of Senior Officials and Experts in Asmara, Eritrea. I'll have those details and plenty more in just a bit. For now, it's back to you, Lindy.
Thanks, Penina. Well, in our top story, foreign ministers from Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan are in the U.S. capital to discuss the controversial building of an Ethiopian mega dam along the Nile River. Once completed, the Grand Renaissance Dam in northern Ethiopia will become Africa's largest hydroelectric power station. But Egypt fears it will greatly affect its already scarce water supply. It relies on the Nile for 80% of its water. The talks in Washington, D.C. follow tough positions taken by Ethiopia and Egypt that have seen previous meetings end without progress. At the center of the dispute are plans to fill up the mega dam. Well, CGTN's Giles Gibson has been following the story for us. He now joins us from Washington, D.C. with the latest. Giles, just bring us up to speed on what's or rather on this meeting that is set to take place over the Nile River.
Well, the US Treasury, which is hosting these talks in Washington, is being fairly tight-lipped about how this is actually going to play out. But this is what we're expecting to happen. We're expecting these talks to get underway behind closed doors at the US Treasury within the next hour or so. In attendance, in addition to the US officials at the US Treasury who are hosting these talks, we're also expecting the president of the World Bank, David Malpass, to be there, and then as well as these three foreign ministers from Ethiopia, Egypt and Sudan. So that's kind of how it's set so far to take place here in the US capital.
Well, Giles, these three main parties, Sudan, Ethiopia and Egypt, have held several unsuccessful talks before. What's behind the US decision to host this latest round of talks?
Well, earlier this week, US President Donald Trump actually had a telephone call with his Egyptian counterpart, President Sisi. We had a White House spokesman telling us that President Trump expressed support for Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan's ongoing negotiations to reach a collaborative agreement on this entire issue. So that statement from the White House really does paint them as this mediator, this external mediator to try and get the Ethiopians and the Egyptians talking about this issue. And what they seem to be painting themselves as this external mediator. We know that that Egypt are very open to the idea, and that the Ethiopians have previously said that they don't want an external mediator. They want to sit down with the sort of three countries involved in this and keep it like that.
So, of course, then these parties are all coming to Washington with each side holding a rather tough stance on this issue. What then is the U.S. coming to this meeting with in terms of trying to break the deadlock?
Well, we're expecting the US Treasury and the Trump administration to try and get Ethiopia and Egypt to try and get into some of the, the technical details here. How many billion cubic meters of water, for example, will the Ethiopians guarantee to the Egyptians after the dam has been finished and once it's actually operational, and just trying to get away from some of this very heavy rhetoric that we've seen from both sides, talking about a possible conflict over it. Ethiopia's Prime Minister has said recently that his country could deploy many millions of people in a potential conflict over this issue. So what the Trump administration are expected to do is try and get the two sides away from that kind of rhetoric and into some of the more technical details that need to be agreed going forward.
Well, thank you so much, Charles Gibson, joining us there live from Washington, where that all-important meeting is set to get underway within the next hour. Well, now let's bring you some analysis on this issue. We spoke to Dr. Hassan Kanenje a little earlier. He is the director of the Horn Institute in Kenya, and he started by explaining what's likely to emerge from these talks in Washington.
I think I'm both hopeful and skeptical. I'm hopeful because I think the nature of the third-party mediator being the United States, it has influence on both countries. It supports militaries of both countries for many years. But at the same time, I'm skeptical because just recently, there have been inflammatory statements coming from both capitals. Now, Egypt has been accusing Ethiopia of not willing to compromise, while Ethiopia thinks Egypt has been taking decisions unilaterally with regard to the proposal it's making to Ethiopia. And because of that complex history of both countries, I think it's going to be challenging. But I think the U.S. can build on its capital as having relations with both countries, perhaps to try and strike a deal or something close to that. 90% or something close to that, of the water for Egypt comes from the River Nile. And therefore, any dangers posed to the River Nile is certainly an existential threat to Egypt, as it sees it. And so it's justified to be concerned about that. However, the 1929-1959 treaties still do not hold, in part because I think these other countries that part of the source of the River Nile, I think they have economic needs that the River Nile can be able to fulfill if they exploit it properly. Egypt is jittery that perhaps the water is not going to be misappropriated and therefore lead to potential drought. And drought, or at least declining waters of the River Nile, can mean a security threat and existential threat to the state of Egypt. And so they are extremely justified to do that. However, I think it's important they come to the table and negotiate, perhaps kind of with some joint measure on how they're going to use the River Nile.
Now, the possible downstream effects of the $4.7 billion dam have been disputed. CGTN's Robert Nagila further explores the stalemate between Ethiopia and Egypt.
The Nile, the world's longest river that serves as a crucial artery for water supplies and power generation to the so-called Nile Basin countries. Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, the DR Congo, Kenya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, South Sudan, Sudan, and Egypt. Its main tributaries, the White and Blue Nile, converge in Khartoum before flowing through Egypt and into the Mediterranean Sea. But a long-running dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia over the use of its waters is threatening to spark a conflict. Ethiopia is constructing a $5 billion Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is about 70% complete and is expected to generate power for Ethiopia's 100 million people. Egypt is concerned the project will restrict its already scarce share of water from the Nile. About 90% of Egypt's irrigation and drinking water comes from the Nile. Cairo says its rights to the river are guaranteed by treaties signed between 1929 and 1959 by the British colonialists. Egypt wants Ethiopia to agree to release a minimum of 40 billion cubic meters of water from the dam annually. It's also calling for the reservoir to be filled over a 7-year period. Ethiopia, for its part, says at its peak, the dam will generate more than 6,000 megawatts of electricity and plans to fill it in 4 years. Egypt has held talks with Ethiopia and the Nile Basin countries for years, but those talks came to a bitter halt in October, the third time they've broken down since 2014. Attempts by Russia to mediate between the two on the sidelines of the Russia-Africa summit bore no fruit. And now, the United States has offered to referee the talks through the U.S. Treasury, scheduled to begin on Wednesday in Washington. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Images may appear to be identical, But looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Now let's head to Sudan, where Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok has promised to resettle those who were displaced during the Darfur conflict. But as Alexandria Majala reports, many are skeptical about returning to their former homes.
Since the ouster of former President Omar al-Bashir, Sudan has been unfolding. With the end of protests after the formation of a transitional government, the country has been making efforts to reconcile its fractured fabric. One of the events that have shaped al-Bashir's legacy is the Darfur conflict. Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok's visit to one of the camps for the internally displaced people in Darfur seeks to open a new chapter for the locals who've been devastated by the war that began in 2003, and they still depend on aid and more aid.
The case of aid is one that is related to the political economy of aid. We shall open a broad community dialogue to discuss this aid. There are many ways of dealing with aid, and as Sudanese people, we will reach an agreement on the way forward.
He's promising to resettle them, but from past experiences, few are willing to buy into the Prime Minister's promises unless the safety is guaranteed.
Our conditions for a return are security, peace, education, healthcare. In addition to education, we need water. Then we can return. But without this, we cannot return.
If peace and security are guaranteed, then we are prepared to go back to the village. We still have children in school, and we hope that they achieve their dreams.
It is true that things are changing in the North African nation after al-Bashir. The Janjaweed militia that was accused of being part of the war that killed over 300,000 has since assumed a new face and is playing a key role in the transitional politics of Sudan. Active fighting has lessened in Darfur in the recent past, but the camps for the internally displaced persons have since solidified from temporary structures to almost permanent settlements. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
The Egyptian military has released the results of its largest ever operation against terrorism this year. According to a spokesperson, the operation resulted in dozens of militants being killed, as well as the destruction of terrorist vehicles, hideouts and weapons. The report comes on the heels of a recent allegiance announcement to ISIL's new leader by militant group Sinai Province. Our Cairo-based correspondent Adel Al-Mahrawi has more.
This week, ISIL's arm in Egypt announced full support to its new leader, vowing more attacks against the populous North African nation. 2 days later, the Egyptian armed forces releases the outcomes of its counter-terrorism military campaign during the past month. It has killed 83 terrorists, destroyed 14 hideouts and 241 vehicles and motorcycles used in terrorist attacks. These are the biggest numbers announced this year.
The armed forces usually sends indirect messages to its opponents. The current timing has a great indication. It's a clear response to the declaration of allegiance from the Sinai province to ISIL. The message basically says that even if there's an allegiance, they don't have any power on the ground.
Security forces have allocated and destroyed 367 road bombs, which targeted its convoys. With all these massive engagements, the death toll among the military personnel was not big. 3 officers were killed in their pursuit to cleanse Egypt from these dangerous threats.
The flow of fighters from Syria to Libya and from there to Egypt continues. During the recent period, the attempts to breach the border have significantly increased, and most of these efforts have been crushed. Led by the Egyptian Air Forces, the military intelligence has gathered immense information about their whereabouts.
The military announcement stressed that it has also targeted human trafficking and smuggling routes, which are usually used to fund these terrorist organizations. In that regard, it has arrested more than 4,700 illegal migrants and destroyed 113 additional vehicles used in transporting weapons and drugs.
While the Egyptian military made sure to emphasize the magnitude of destruction it has inflicted over the terrorist groups, the numbers announced also show an increase in militant activity. That has pushed the parliament to approve the president's requests to extend the state of emergency all over the country. Adil Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
To the United Kingdom now, where Parliament has officially been dissolved to pave the way for a general election next month. This comes as the Prime Minister's latest Brexit deal was again rejected by lawmakers. Boris Johnson agreed to shelve the deal last week in exchange for a snap election. Kicking off his election campaign, Johnson says he's hopeful the vote could break the Brexit deadlock. Russia is urging Iran to fulfill its commitments to the 2015 nuclear deal. Russia's foreign minister has, however, partially blamed the United States for withdrawing from the pact and reimposing sanctions. On Wednesday, Iran's state media reported the resumption of uranium enrichment activity at a plant south of the capital. The move was yet another retreat by Iran from the nuclear deal made 4 years ago. Well, let's take a short break. Here's what's still ahead on the program. The UN says violence in Cameroon is causing a humanitarian emergency with 1.9 million people needing help. And floods in the DRC lead to a sharp rise in food prices.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
The UN says the ongoing violence in Cameroon's northwest and southwest regions is causing a rapidly increasing humanitarian emergency. So far, an estimated 1.9 million people have been affected, a 15-fold increase since 2017. CGTN's Cham Gono has more.
In recent months, violence in Cameroon's northwest and southwest regions has escalated dramatically. While briefing the Council, UN's Children Fund spokesperson Marixi Mercado referenced the ongoing violence to separatist clashes that began in late 2017. She pointed out that at least 1 million children were affected in the West African nation, which until a few years ago was among the most settled and peaceful in the region.
What began as a political crisis in the northwest and southwest regions is now a quickly deteriorating humanitarian emergency. Around 1.9 million people, about half of whom are children, are estimated to be in need, which is an increase of 80% compared to 2018 and an almost 15-fold increase since 2017.
With the worsening security, UN's Humanitarian Coordinating Office insists that humanitarian violations continue to be committed by both separatist and government forces.
When armed groups like these kidnap students on the way to school, that's absolutely horrific and must be condemned.
The youth are the most affected as the situation has deprived them of education. Thousands of schools continue to shut down amid threats by separatists looking leverage for political solution to the crisis.
3 years of violence and instability in the northwest and southwest regions of Cameroon have left more than 855,000 children out of school. A very real fear of violence also keeps parents from sending their children to school and teachers and staff from reporting to work.
According to UNICEF, security fears continue to hamper humanitarian assistance in Cameroon. 529 security incidents have been recorded in the southwest and northwest since the beginning of the year. A lack of funding has also been a major issue in the West African nation. Cham Hono, CGTN.
Right, let's turn our attention now to the central region of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where heavy rainfall has caused flash floods and destroyed hundreds of acres of crops. This has led to price increases in food items, which millions of Congolese can't afford. Here's CGTN's Chris Ochemrenga with more.
Kinshasa City, after a heavy downpour in October, the city's drainage channels couldn't take the large amounts of water gushing in. But the effect of the heavy rain was even worse in farming areas around the country. Large tracts of crops were destroyed in the central province of Kasai. That's led some farmers to increase prices of their produce. Jean-Paul Mpoyi and his family say life has become difficult.
The cost of living has become very high for us because prices of food products have shot up due to the extreme weather changes.
Scientists say climate change is to blame for changing weather trends which are affecting DRC.
The changes in weather patterns have caused our farmers to get poor yields. Flooding, for example, has destroyed hectares of crops. We should brace ourselves for tough times.
The impact of the extreme weather has affected many families in Kinshasa. The DRC has the largest part of the Congo Basin rainforest, which is supposed to help mitigate climate change. But deforestation and the weak enforcement of laws against environmental degradation have led to the loss of thousands of hectares of forest cover. Meteorologists are calling on the government to take action.
Our government should come up with a national plan against climate change. It should also enforce the laws that prohibit illegal logging and educate citizens about the effects of cutting down trees.
Heavy rains are likely to go on until May next year. And if heavy rains persist, it could be disastrous for Jean-Paul and hundreds of other Congolese who are struggling to make ends meet. Chris Sochamringa, CGTN, Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo.
Kenya has conducted its first ever household survey on energy usage when cooking. The research formed part of the country's fact-finding process as it works towards its pledge of a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2028. While the survey showed the various sources of energy people use to prepare their food in Kenya, it also found that more than 21,000 people are killed each year from cooking with charcoal and wood. CGTN's Robert Nagila has more.
Charcoal and firewood are the most common fuels used by a majority of Kenyan households for cooking. A recent government survey found that 80% of households relied solely on either charcoal or firewood as their primary cooking fuel, with $660 million worth of charcoal consumed each year. Worryingly, this resulted in the deaths of over 21,500 people each year from cooking with solid fuels like charcoal and firewood. The report says the health risks were greatest in rural areas where 90% of households use wood stoves compared to 70% nationwide. The World Health Organization says globally about 3 billion people cook with solid fuels such as charcoal and coal on open fires or traditional stoves, producing high levels of carbon monoxide, which kills about 4 million people each year. The Kenyan government has committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30%, with clean cooking accounting for about 14% under the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, a target it hopes to achieve by 2028. As part of the 17 Global Development Goals, countries have committed to ensure universal access to clean, modern energy for cooking by the year 2030. The number of Kenyans killed by dirty stoves and fuels is double that of neighboring Uganda. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
South Africa is participating in the China International Import Expo. The country's Minister of Trade and Industry, Ibrahim Patel, spoke to CGTN about the opportunities the expo provides South Africa.
The expo is an opportunity for us to showcase South Africa's inherent strengths, to show the kind of products that we manufacture, the things that we grow, the things that we dig, and highlight those in a growing part of the global economy, which is the Chinese market. Looking forward, we also want to highlight and showcase South Africa as a tourism destination China's middle class is growing very significantly, and aggregate consumption is rising in China. So for us, the expo is an opportunity to say South Africa is here. We make some great products. For example, if you're looking for one of the world's most advanced full-body X-ray machines that are used for medical scanning, they are made in South Africa. If you buy citrus fruit, and we know the Chinese market is a big consumer of citrus fruit, South Africa is the world's second biggest citrus exporter. If you look to cars, whether it is utility vehicles that can survive in difficult terrains or luxury vehicles, South Africa is the African continent's biggest automaker. So each of these will be highlighted.
Meanwhile, Senegal continues to grow its agricultural partnership with China. Students from the Confucius Institute in Dakar's Cheikh Anta Diop University will get a chance to take part in a special training program.
For the next 3 months, these 38 university students will take part in a special agriculture program. Chinese agri-experts will train them in agricultural theories and practices.
I hope students will get a better understanding of agriculture after receiving our theory and practice training.
The programs will be tailor-made to correspond with Senegal's soil and weather conditions. They will also learn to grow the country's major agricultural exports, like peanuts.
This mission is very important because it shows us what can be done with what we have. Because it's not about bringing seeds from Chinese, fertilizers from China, or agricultural inputs. No, everything is taken from here and with what we find here.
The program's participants are excited to kick things off.
Knowing the importance of agriculture in the development of a country, we are committed to be helpful to the nation and participate in the development of our dear Senegal.
The training program will take place from November 2019 to January 2020. Astatal, CGTN.
And let's now go to Panina for your latest business news.
Thank you, Lindy. Coming up on Africa Live Business. Zimbabwe fires doctors as worker strike extends past 60 days. And we'll look at developments at the 23rd session of the Intergovernmental Committee of Senior Officials and Experts in Asmara, Eritrea.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Zimbabwe has dismissed 77 doctors for engaging in a strike that has now stretched beyond 60 days. The Southern African nation has termed the action illegal and is trying to contain growing unrest within its workforce amidst threats of more strike action. CGTN's Farai Mokutuya reports.
They are meant to be in the wards outside which they are milling around. But a deadlock over pay demands has seen a crippling doctor strike enter a third month. The Labour Court ruled the industrial action illegal, and on Tuesday, 77 doctors were dismissed for ignoring the order to return to work. Those in the firing line remain defiant.
So I was served with my disciplinary hearing letter 2 days ago, and like the rest of the constituents, I'm not attending to those hearings because I have not committed any crime by being broke.
Aren't you worried about losing your job and jeopardizing the career that you trained for?
Many people don't realize that we have lost our jobs long back when our salaries have been eroded. So we've just been doing community services, if I may say, was our salaries are now less than 100.
Doctors aren't the only ones feeling the pinch. A small number of teachers, nurses and other public servants staged a protest on Wednesday where they mourned their eroded incomes.
The civil servants' plan was to march to the offices of the Ministries of Public Service and Finance to air their grievances. However, they've been blocked by a very heavy police presence. The police say that only union leaders will be allowed to deliver the petition.
Like doctors, they want their salaries pegged to the US dollar exchange rate, failure of which will see an escalation.
This is just the beginning of a sustained struggle against austerity measures. This is just the beginning of a sustained struggle demanding a living wage. So this is going to be a weekly thing. But already we have withdrawn our labor. We are no longer working. The schools are closing. The hospitals are closing. The public sector is collapsing.
Government has acknowledged the need to review wages, but says urgent demands, including grain imports to mitigate the drought, have exhausted any surplus funds. Farangwa Kutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Commercial bank stocks in Kenya have steadily appreciated over the last 2 days after news that Parliament had lifted caps on commercial bank lending rates. While the move has increased investor appetite in banking, borrowers have been left jittery. The chairman of the Kenya Bankers Association says there is no risk of a spike in lending rates.
If you look at the business environment today, banks have reached a new business model. So if I'm able to lend to a current customer at 13%, I've accepted his risk profile. So the whole industry, and like us KCB, that will not change the next day. So the fear that there's a massive repricing the next day, banks are waiting to just go in and disrupt and rupture the market. It's actually not true.
Representatives from across 14 Eastern Africa states are in Eritrea. They're attending an annual meeting organized by the UN's Economic Commission for Africa. It aims to chart ways of exploiting opportunities emerging from regional integration and trade. CGTN's Gurum Chala has the details.
With an overall economic growth of about 6.4%, the Eastern Africa region is the fastest growing bloc in the continent. From Somalia to Kenya, from Sudan to Ethiopia, Djibouti, Rwanda, Burundi, all the Comoros Islands, all countries in the Eastern Africa region are in dire need of development. But existing critical problems have brought leaders to Asmara.
We must create almost 8.5 million jobs a year to be able to absorb the youth that are getting into the job market. That is a huge challenge, and that is why we are here today, is essentially to say what is the economic blueprint that we can produce that would allow for us to be able to create the kinds of jobs that are needed.
This is the 23rd meeting of the Intergovernmental Committee of Senior Officials and Experts. It has brought together ministers and other stakeholders to discuss more growth and regional integration. The host, Eritrea's Foreign Minister Osman Saleh, says there is more hope for the region to integrate than there was before.
Our sub-region, the Horn of Africa, after decades of externally induced inter- and intra-state conflicts, has begun to breathe air of hope and togetherness, peace and stability, critical prerequisite for regional integration, is a new opportunity that we can leverage on for regional integration.
The 3 days high-level dialogue here in Asmara also aims to redefine some of the regional growth strategies and at the end improve them for better outcomes. The agenda includes investment in energy and infrastructure, social cohesion and trade. They will also review the prospects of investment in the blue economy. Grumtala CGTN, Asmara, Eritrea.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has launched the Automotive Special Economic Zone in Tshwane. He says that it demonstrates that the country remains an attractive investment destination despite its current challenges. The initiative is projected to attract investment in excess of $243 million and create more than 6,700 direct jobs. CGTN Sulisan Jamila with more.
Special economic zones play a key role in driving South Africa's new industrial strategy, which is aimed at reigniting the country's economy. The zones are geographically designed areas which government identifies for targeted economic activities. These zones are supported by a range of laws and incentives and are meant to attract mainly foreign direct investment. The Ford Motor Company is one of the companies that have answered the call of government's appeal for foreign direct investment and has partnered with government to open the first automotive incubation center adjacent to this special economic zone.
We believe in this country's potential to become an economic powerhouse in the global automotive manufacturing environment. We are fully committed and support that we will continue to contribute to the South African Automotive Master Plan 2035 vision. We aim to contribute towards the goal of achieving 1% of global vehicle production in South Africa.
The automotive zone is expected to attract automotive manufacturing companies and related services.
The building of a factory, the building of an industrial facility, is one of the most uplifting things that you can have in any economy. And it is happening here under our own noses, and we are grateful for that.
The initiative will create almost 7,000 direct jobs.
This is phenomenal. You don't just stumble across 6,700 jobs every day. It takes a lot of doing to create a single job. It is immensely encouraging and comes at a time when business, government, labor, and civil society must work together to resolve the twin challenges of slow economic growth and unemployment. We are on a firm path to rebuild our country and return our economy to higher levels of productivity, as well as to transform it to make it much more inclusive, so that we can have inclusive growth.
The launch is taking place just hours ahead of the start of the investment conference, where government hopes to raise 1.2 trillion rand in new investments. Yodisa Njamela for CGTN in Tshwane, South Africa.
Britain is expected to leave the European Union at the end of January next year after the deadline was extended from October 31st. But it's still uncertain whether the UK will be ready to leave with a deal in hand. The wrangling has gone on for over 3 years, dragging the economy and the pound weaker. Sumitra Naidu takes a look at how this uncertainty is playing out in South Africa.
The UK is South Africa's fourth largest trading partner. Exports to the UK since January this year totaled over $3 billion. Over 175,000 jobs have been created through this partnership. This is why South Africa wasted no time in securing itself. It started trade negotiations months after Brexit became a reality.
Rollover trade agreements have been signed to ensure that the current trade terms that South Africa has with the EU would then apply to trade with the UK. All of the items such as motor vehicles and primary goods that are exported to the UK continue to be traded tariff-free and at the same rates.
A few weeks ago, South Africa and its neighbours officially signed a deal to ensure that trade will continue as per normal no matter what transpires. But the health of the UK is also important to South Africa. That economy is under pressure. The weaker pound has pushed up inflation, making goods more expensive. Any more economic strain could limit the UK's buying power.
South Africa is good for now. It's also well positioned for the trade negotiations that will come after the UK finally leaves the EU.
There are still some products that are traded between South Africa and the UK that rely on quite complex global supply chains, and there is uncertainty there until we see what the deal looks like between the UK and the EU. Of course, what we all often sometimes forget about Brexit is that this is just really the first step in the process of divorce, if you like. So when the initial separation agreement takes place between the UK and the EU, there will still be many years of negotiations ahead to structure what the new partnership looks like.
It gives African countries an opportunity to then come up with new terms for trade with the UK, and this is where ourselves as Siaka Africa actually play a key role to match investors to the appropriate investments. We identify investments within the Africa space. If you look at the African economy, we're looking at a 1.25 billion population, which equates to about $3 trillion worth of potential trade that can actually happen. So, there are a lot of great opportunities.
Which is exactly what former British Prime Minister Theresa May did when she visited Africa and other regions. She discussed new partnerships and strengthened the ongoing ones to make sure that there would be other relationships outside of the European Union. Sumitra Nadu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
In Beijing, Chinese President Xi Jinping has met with French President Emmanuel Macron. The meeting led to billions of dollars worth of deals covering the environment, energy and cultural ties.
The two leaders announced $15 billion worth of agreements. And that came with another decision on the same day. China announced sales of 4 billion in euro-denominated sovereign bonds as part of the country's first offering of euro-denominated bonds in 15 years. Regarding the agreements he and Macron reached, President Xi said major projects coming up include those in nuclear energy and aerospace. Two documents also were signed on protecting biodiversity and tackling climate change. In the culture and communication sphere, the two sides will focus on their upcoming cultural exchange year of 2021. While encouraging more Chinese people to travel and study in France. Some Chinese experts will also go to France to help prepare the Notre Dame Cathedral. This year marks the 55th anniversary of China-France diplomatic ties. President Xi noted that France was the first Western country to formalize such relations with China. He called on the two countries to take more responsibilities in maintaining international order and multilateralism as the world undergoes changes rarely seen in a century.
The two countries should maintain their traditions of independent policies and jointly safeguard the international system with the United Nations at the core, the international order based on international law, as well as the multilateral trading regime with WTO rules as the cornerstone. We advocate mutual respect and equality, while standing opposed to law of the jungle and winner-takes-all practices, as well as hegemony.
And Xi's attitude for openness was echoed by Macron, who said China's opening up presents great opportunities and French companies should take their chances in the Chinese market. The French president is on a 3-day state visit to China. On Tuesday, he also attended the opening ceremony of the second China International Import Expo in Shanghai. Robert Nagila, CGTN.
That's it for now on Africa Live Business. But later on Global Business, we'll look at the impact on the Kenyan economy after the country lifted interest rate caps on commercial bank loans. The country has had the caps for the last 3 years. That will be at the top of the hour. I shall see you then. For now, it's back to you, Lindy.
Thanks, Panina. Well, do stay with us. Here's what's still ahead on the program. Coming up, movie experts in Nigeria partner with young professionals to boost the Nollywood film industry.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Panata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Despite the movie Lionheart getting disqualified from this year's Oscar race, Nollywood, Nigeria's film industry, continues to roar on. Industry veterans are now teaming up with young filmmakers to help them reach their full potential. Phil Lihaza has more from the nation's capital, Abuja.
Bem Peve, one of Nigeria's ace movie producers, is engaging young proteges in filmmaking at this training center known as Safe House. Bem says there are lots of young talents in Nigeria, but there are not enough training centers to develop them to professional levels.
We'll train them based on the things that we already know and the experiences that we already have. We share these experiences with them so that they can learn and understand and become professionals and understand the aspect of filmmaking, like producing, directing, script writing, even acting.
According to UNESCO, Nigeria's Nollywood produces an average of 1,500 movies per year, the second largest industry behind India's Bollywood and overtaking Hollywood, now in third. The majority of the movies produced in Nigeria are below the standard of Bollywood and Hollywood films when compared to picture quality and storytelling. Experts say a huge challenge facing the Nigerian movie industry is that most filmmakers produce movies in a hurry to make profit from a huge population of nearly 200 million people in the country.
Let's care more. Let's put a little bit more thought, a little bit more passion, a little bit more research, a little bit more patience into getting the right camera, getting the right crew, getting the right actor, getting the right story, getting the right everything, then we can do.
The focus for these Nollywood professionals is to help ensure that the Nigerian movie industry produces high-quality films of the future.
And young filmmakers here are beginning to aspire for greater heights in film production.
With what I have learned here, I believe I can be the best film director in Nigeria.
I don't just want to make movies or film like that. That's why I'm here, to learn how to be a professional filmmaker.
Nigeria currently does not have any professional training center run solely by the government. Experts say until more film schools are established across the country, private academies like Safe House could be the only hope of future quality movie productions in the country. Phil Ihaza, CGTN, Abuja.
And coming up in your sports news, up next. Zambia's national women's team arrives in Nairobi for their Tokyo 2020 Olympics qualifier against Kenya.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born